Chapter 28, and we will now divide the animal kingdom into its two major groups, the invertebrates and the vertebrates. The invertebrates contain the majority of animals in the animal kingdom, and these are the groups in which there is a lack of a brain cavity and a spinal column, consequently no vertebrae. This constitutes about 97% of all the animals on Earth, and many of these are aquatic. Here are just a few examples of the many invertebrates that are found in the animal kingdom. Let's take a look and review some of the terminology that we're going to be using as we talk both about invertebrates and vertebrates. The first is that we have parazoa, meaning no true embryonic tissues. So having embryonic tissues is characteristic of all animals, but we do have a group that are called animals, particularly porifera, phylum porifera, the sponges, which don't have true embryonic tissues, but do have other characteristics that allow them to be in the animal kingdom. So parazoa, only one group that we're going to look at, the porifera or the sponges, do not have true embryonic tissues. In this group, we also see that from a symmetry perspective, that sponges are asymmetrical, that there is really no particular organization of cells into tissues. Then we look at eumetazoa, or just metazoa, as the true embryonic tissues that are going to differentiate into those categories we talked about last chapter, the epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissues. So this group, the metazoa, will include all of the other animals except the porifera or the sponges. So within this group, we can then further subdivide within the metazoa group by symmetry. So in this group, all animals will be either radially symmetrical or bilaterally symmetrical. And as we defined that last class, radially would be as if you took an axis down the center of the animal and looked all the way around in circumference. That animal would be the same at every point along the way. These animals do develop embryonic tissues, but they have only two layers, the endoderm and the ectoderm. And for our purposes, the only phyla that we're going to look at that has falls into this group would be the cnidarians. The C is silent. This would include animals such as the hydra, the jellies, and the sea anemones. We'll look at them further. The other major group based on symmetry are the bilaterally symmetrical animals. These animals will have three embryonic tissues, so three layers, endoderm, ectoderm, and then a middle layer, the mesoderm. And we can divide them into three groups. The platyhelminthes are kind of on their own. This is phylum platyhelminthes. And I'll discuss why that is in just a moment. But the other two major groups are the protostomes and the deuterostomes. This has to do with the primitive gut, which will become the digestive system. And in the protostomes, the mouth develops first, and in the deuterostomes, the anus develops first. So the mouth first groups as phylum Nematoda, Annelida, Mollusca, and Arachnida. Sorry, quick correction there. It is not Arachnida, it's Arthropoda, of which Arachnida is a subgroup of Arthropoda. But it's the arthropods that are our last phylum of protostomes. Then we have the deuterostomes with the anus first, and that's the phylum Echinodermata and Chordata. Now the platyhelminthes, this is a special phylum because they have a strange kind of embryonic gut that has really only one opening. So the mouth and anus are essentially the same thing. So material goes in and out of that single opening. So that's why they don't really fall into one of these two groups. So let's start looking at our groupings of individuals in which phyla. So the phylum Porifera are the sponges, and these sponges are the simplest of all animals. It is believed that the protist choanflagellates was what evolved eventually into our phylum Porifera, our sponges. They are all aquatic. They are parazoans. They do not have true embryonic tissues. They're asymmetrical. So you notice that they have different bumps or, areas that bulge out at different places, and they're not the same either across, left to right, or circumferentially. The adults are sessile, which means non-modal, not moving, but the larvae have some mobility. And that's how they settle and move on to a substrate and grow. And so that's what helps them be still considered to be in the animal kingdom. So when we continue to look at the internal anatomy of these, this phylum Porifera, the sponges, they're called porifera, pore, meaning they are pore bearers. And that is how we see how they get a water flow through them. So here is the body of the sponge. It has all these pores or openings in which water can flow in and then back out of the animal. There are certain cell types. They have very specific cell types, but not really a true tissue per se, not a nervous tissue or a muscle tissue, etc. So these one special cell type that I do want you to know are called the choancytes, these cells, and we find them along this inner lining. The choancytes, which kind of sounds like the choanflagellates, which are the protists, which were the ancestors, these are the ones that as water comes through, these guys can filter feed. So they are filtering this water for bacteria or algae that they eat. So that's the only cell type that you need to know from these sponges. So when we look again, sponges have no digestive, respiratory, circulatory, reproductive, or nervous systems, so i.e. no tissues that make those up, even though they do have specialized cell types. They're filter feeders, as I mentioned, with the choancytes, and they trap their particles in the water as it flows through the pores. Here's a video that you can watch when you have a moment. Talking about reproduction, these animals can reproduce asexually through budding or growing a new sponge right off the side of itself, but they also reproduce sexually. Sponges are hermaphroditic. They release egg and sperm into the water. If I go back one slide, we see here's an oocyte that is located in one of these cells here. One of the choancytes, and the choancytes itself can release and become sperm, and they both get released into the water and leave the sponge body to find a new location. We move on to our next phylum, which is the phylum Cnidaria. The cnidarians include hydra that we looked at in lab, jellies, previously known as jellyfish, sea anemones, and corals. So the cnidarians are metazoans. So they do have true tissues. They do have true tissues. This group has only two germ layers, only the endoderm and the ectoderm, and they exhibit radial symmetry. Additionally, all cnidarians contain specialized stinging cells. Here's a stinging cell that has a nemesis in it. This nemesis, when it gets brushed or touched, will trigger the release of a barb, which can grab on and embed itself into another organism, which has a thread that releases a poison or a toxin. So within phylum Cnidaria, there are two body plans. There is the medusa body plan, which is called the bell form, kind of looks like a little parachute. And then there is the polyp form, which is a stalk form that has a base which adheres to rocks or substrates in the water, and then free tentacles. So the polyps are sessile, they are fixed, and the medusas float around. Some cnidarians display both body plans, so they may be a medusa at some point and then become a polyp, or they may stay a medusa their whole life. If we look at reproduction in the phylum Cnidaria, we see that there is asexual budding. We saw that in the hydra in lab, and it occurs also in corals. We see also that there is sexual reproduction. Remember, for the animal kingdom, sexual reproduction is predominant, where they release gametes into the water. And we saw with hydra that that was a dioecious species, meaning they have male hydra and female hydra. For tissues, again, they do have true tissues, so they have a nervous system, but it's rather primitive, and it's called a nerve net, or a loose connection of nerve cells. This can be seen in species that are that exist primarily in the medusa form, as a circle on the top of their medusa bell structure, and you see the sort of round circle on the top of them. Additionally, there is a gastrovascular cavity. So they don't have a true stomach and blood system per se, but rather they have a single opening that serves both functions and also serves as both the mouth and the anus. So digestion takes place there, the exchange of gases, movement of any fluids, etc. And all of phylum Cnidaria are carnivorous. Here we see a coral. So we have the phylum Cnidaria. You do not need to know separate subdivisions for the cnidarians, but they include additionally corals and sea anemones, which exist primarily as the polyp form. And here's a video to watch about those. When we look at another group, the jellies exist predominantly as the medusa form. And here we can see those nematocysts bearing their stinging cells. There's another group of cnidarians called the box-shaped or box jellies. So they have a slightly different appearance to them, and they are the most dangerous of all the cnidarians. There are some species that are in fact deadly. Then we move on to the last group, the hydra. So hydra exists both in a polyp and medusa form. So they can exist as a medusa and then move on to the polyp form, where they affix themselves to the ground of underwater. This is primarily freshwater and mostly sessile. So when they go into their polyp form, they stay that way. All right, as we move on to our next groups of phyla, we'll see that from now on we are looking at all bilateral animals. So before we had the sponges, which had no symmetry, the cnidarians, which were radially symmetrical, and now we're moving on to the bilateral animals, which have bilateral symmetry, or right and left halves. All of these animals have 3 germ layers: ectoderm, mesoderm, endoderm. And within them, we can subdivide them into 3 groups: the platyhelminthes, or the flatworms, and we put them into this group because they don't really fall into the protostomes or the deuterostomes. They do not have both a mouth or an anus. They have one opening. They are also acoelomates, meaning they do not have a body cavity. So that's what all these terms are about body cavity. And the body cavity is formed in the mesoderm. They do have a mesoderm, but it's solid, no spaces. The protostomes, which include the phyla Nematoda, Annelida, Mollusca, and Arthropoda. The nematodes are pseudocoelomates, meaning that they do have a body cavity, but it's not completely in the mesoderm, so therefore it doesn't count as a full coelomate. And then everybody else is going to be full coelomate. They're going to have a body cavity embedded into the mesoderm. So that's Annelida, Mollusca, Arthropoda. The deuterostomes, which have the anus developing first, we have two coelomate groups, the echinoderms and the chordates. So let's look at the phylum Platyhelminthes. Platyhelminthes are the flatworms. They have a gastrovascular cavity. They do not have a complete gut. They have a single opening, which serves as both the mouth and the anus, so they don't fall into either protostomes or deuterostomes. These organisms are hermaphroditic, meaning they carry both eggs and sperm. They have a very primitive excretory system, so that's how they get rid of their waste products. They have these unique cells called flame cells, and the flame cells will allow for a transport out the side of the organism in lots of little pores. Some platyhelminthes, some flatworms, are free living, meaning that they go out and look for their own food, while some are parasitic, meaning they feed directly off living animals. And it's within this phylum that we start to see development of cephalization. Cephalization, cephal means head. So we start to see the beginnings of animals that have a head region where the sensory organs are located. We take a look at some examples of platyhelminthes. In this first example, this is an example of a planaria. It's not the same planaria that we saw in lab, but it's an example of planaria. You do not need to know these class names. In B and C, these are flukes. Flukes are parasitic worms which feed off of other living things, and they are usually internal. They can be external feeders as well, so sometimes they can get inside of the body. And D is the tapeworms, which are also an internal parasite. But all of these are flatworms. The planaria are free living. They are not parasites. So as we move on to our next group of phyla, they are all protostomes. Protostomes, remember, that when they go through their embryonic divisions and they go through gastrulation, that's forming the gut. It's got that word gast in it. Anytime you see that, you think stomach, digestion. So we're forming the digestive system, and the blastopore becomes first the mouth, then the anus forms in protostomes. For the deuterostomes, the anus develops from the blastopore and then the mouth. So our very first group of protostomes would be phylum Mollusca, and mollusca means soft body, and if you have ever eaten clams or scallops, you know that they are a very soft tissue. They often, though, many of these animals come with a hard shell around them. So remember that everybody from now on is bilaterally symmetrical, and they are going to be predominantly coelomates, having a body cavity within that develops from within their mesoderm. There is one exception, and I'll point that out when we get to it. So the body plan for mollusca is that they have a structure called the mantle. That's the region of the animal that secretes a shell. And many of these do have shells, these mollusks. with the exception of the cephalopods. They have a muscular foot, and the foot is what they use for locomotion, to move. The visceral mass is the rest of the organism. That's where their organs are found. They have a complete digestive system, so a complete system that has both a mouth and an anus. They utilize gills for respiration, for taking oxygen out of the water and supplying to their body tissues. They have what's called an open circulatory system. Everybody in mollusca except for the cephalopods, and because they have a closed circulatory system. So open means they have a heart, but that heart pumps fluid just out and around their organs. They don't have blood vessels where the cephalopods do. So there's 3 classes, and I would like you to know these classes. Remember, kingdom, phylum, class. 3 classes within mollusca. We have gastropoda, bivalva, and cephalopoda. So those are the 3 subdivisions of phylum Mollusca. Let's look first at gastropoda. So gastropoda includes the snails and the slugs. So they're kind of snails without the shell. Conchs and nudibranchs, those are the types of class gastropoda. So gastropoda means literally stomach, foot. And so they have on them here's the head region. They do have a head region. The stomach goes right into their foot, where all mollusks have a foot for how they move around. And that foot pushes them forward. The next class in mollusca are the bivalves, or the bivalvia, and those would be clams, oysters, and scallops. So bivalve refers to the 2 shells. So those 2 shells are their bivalves, and they are filter feeders found both in marine and freshwater situations. But when you take a look inside, they have all of the organ structures that would be found in a bilaterally symmetrical organism. Our next group, the class Cephalopoda. Cephalopoda means head, foot. So this would be the octopus, the squid, and the nautilus. The nautilus is the only one that has a shell in this group. The squids and the octopus do not. This is the most unique group of mollusks. They have a closed circulatory system, meaning they do have a series of blood vessels associated with their heart. They also will release an inky substance, which is a smokescreen for helping them get away from predators. They are dioecious, meaning they have 2 sexes, males and females. And they are the most intelligent of all of the invertebrates. And here's a video for you to take a look at. We now move on to the final group of phyla for this video, and then we'll pick up with the other phyla in the next video. But this last group are the phylum Annelida, or the annelids. These are the segmented worms, meaning you can actually see this in the worms. They have little segments to them, little repeating units, and they are the most advanced of all the worms. They are free living, or there are some that are parasitic, and we find these worms in aquatic situations. So there are annelids in both the sea and freshwater, and we do find some annelids on land as well. And they have compartments which are set up within these segments. They have a complete digestive system, as well as they have a closed circulatory system. So they do have a number of hearts, and then they do have a series of vessels which they will push their blood fluid through. And finally, we have some examples from phylum Annelida, the segmented worms. Here's probably the most familiar of them, the earthworm. is shown here. So this is a terrestrial or a land annelid. Here is a freshwater annelid. It's a leech, which is parasitic, and meaning that it will latch on to an animal and eat from that live animal. And then finally, we have a marine worm called the feather duster. So this is a segmented annelid that is found in the ocean. So in the remainder of chapter 28, in the next video, we will pick up with the additional phyla to take a look at.